The summer Naomi Kessler turned 11. She started collecting things nobody else on Cane Creek Road wanted. Every Saturday morning that June, she pedaled her bicycle down the gravel county roads outside Sparta, Tennessee, stopping at the edges of fields where old aluminum irrigation pipe lay rusting in the fence rows, abandoned by farmers who'd switched to center pivot systems or given up on irrigating those particular fields altogether. She wasn't collecting it to sell for scrap. She wasn't building a fort or a go-kart ramp the way her brother assumed. She had one quiet purpose that summer, and she wasn't telling a single soul what it was. She knocked on doors the way her mother had taught her to, polite and direct. Farmer after farmer gave her some version of the same answer. "Sure, sweetheart, take what you want. It's just rusting out there anyway. Been meaning to haul it off for scrap for 3 years now." Then they'd lean against their porch rails and watch an 11-year-old girl wrestle 20-foot aluminum lateral pipe sections into the little trailer her father had welded together out of an old utility trailer frame. And they'd laugh, not unkindly, just the particular baffled laugh grown men reserve for a child doing something they can't begin to explain to themselves. By the end of June, Naomi had more irrigation pipes stacked behind her family's barn than some of the working farms in White County still kept in active use. Nobody in Sparta knew what she was planning. Not her brother, not her mother, not even her father yet. They were about to find out. White County sits on the Cumberland Plateau in Middle Tennessee, where the land breaks into long limestone ridges and narrow hollows, and where the same handful of families had farmed the same red clay ground for 4 generations without ever finding much reason to remark on it. The Kesslers ran 62 acres of hay and beef cattle on a ridge above the Cane Creek. Daniel Kessler, Naomi's father, was a quiet, deliberate man who measured most decisions in cost per acre before he measured them in much else, a habit built from watching diesel and fertilizer prices climb for 20 years while cattle prices did whatever they wanted. Carol Kessler taught 4th grade at the elementary school in town and kept a garden along the south side of the house that produced every August more tomatoes than 4 people could reasonably eat, a fact she seemed to take a certain quiet pride in. Naomi's grandfather, Earl Kessler, lived in the front room of the old farmhouse, 83 years old, hard of hearing in his left ear from 30 years running a chainsaw for the county road department, and in the habit of spending most mornings at the kitchen table with black coffee and a stack of soil and water conservation bulletins he'd been saving since the early 1970s. He read them the way some men reread the same 3 westerns every winter, cover to cover, and then again. It was Earl who noticed, before anyone else in the family did, that Naomi didn't look at the pasture the way her older brother Colt did. Colt looked at the cattle, counting them out of habit every time he crossed a field. Naomi looked at the ground itself, at where the grass stayed green 2 weeks longer than everywhere else after a dry spell, and where it browned first every July like clockwork, and at the low swale along the north fence line that held standing water for 2 full days after a hard rain, while the ground 20 yards uphill was already dust by noon the same day. The summer White County entered its 2nd consecutive year of below normal rainfall. Naomi began noticing a problem that the adults around her had mostly just learned to live alongside, the way people learn to live with a bad knee. Her father's upper hayfield, 11 acres running along the ridge above the barn, had been cutting thinner every single year for 3 years running. The extension agent for White County, a deliberate, soft-spoken man named Roy Tackett, had driven out twice that spring to look at it and offered the standard advice extension agents give when there isn't much budget to work with. Overseed the thin patches in the fall. Consider splitting the fertilizer program into 3 smaller applications instead of 1 heavy one. Maybe think, eventually, about running a pipeline up from the creek if the money ever allowed for it. Naomi had been standing at the edge of both of those conversations, and both times she'd asked Roy Tackett a question he clearly wasn't used to fielding from an 11-year-old girl in rubber boots. If you ran a pipe up from the creek, how would the water get up the hill without electricity? Roy had looked down at her for a second longer than he probably meant to. "It wouldn't, hun. Water doesn't run uphill on its own. You'd need a pump for that, and pumps need power, and power costs money all summer long every single day you're running it." She'd nodded slowly, the particular nod of someone who had been circling an idea in her head for weeks and had just been handed the one piece she needed to lock it fully into place. That conversation happened in April. By the first week of June, she was collecting pipe. Here is what Naomi had worked out, sitting on the tailgate of her father's truck with one of Earl's old bulletins spread open across her knees that most of the adults along Cane Creek had never quite bothered to put together themselves, mostly because they'd never needed to. Water does not care what anything costs. It only cares about elevation. The upper hayfield sat roughly 19 feet higher in elevation than the farm pond at the bottom of the property, an old spring-fed pond that had never gone dry, not even during the drought of 2007 that people in Sparta still measured every other bad summer against. 19 feet sounded enough until Naomi actually worked through the friction loss over the 400 and some feet of pipe run the distance would require. Math she did first with a garden hose and a 5-gallon bucket one entire exhausting Saturday afternoon, timing exactly how long it took the bucket to fill at various hose lengths laid out across the yard, until she understood in her own hands what Earl's bulletins only described in tables of numbers. 19 feet over that distance wasn't enough. The pressure would bleed out before the water ever reached the top of the ridge. But there was a second option. A shallow limestone sink on the north end of the property, half hidden behind a stand of cedar scrub, where rainwater gathered after every hard storm and stood for 3 or 4 days before it either soaked down into the karst below or dried off under the sun. That sink sat roughly 26 feet higher in elevation than the thinning section of the hayfield, and 26 feet, run through pipe of the right diameter, was enough head pressure, according to the numbers Naomi worked out at the kitchen table with Earl using a chart from one of his oldest bulletins on gravity-fed livestock watering systems, to push water through a drip network covering close to 2 acres without a single electric pump ever running for a minute. The aluminum pipe she'd spent the first June collecting wasn't going to be the delivery pipe itself, not directly. Most of it was old 2-inch lateral irrigation pipe, riveted aluminum sections designed to be moved by hand across a field and coupled together with quick latch fittings, the kind of pipe that mostly went out of use once center pivot systems became affordable in the 90s. What Naomi understood, reading through Earl's bulletins that spring, was this exact pipe, laid as a stationary gravity-fed main line rather than a portable sprinkler line, could carry water from the sink down to the field perfectly well, cheaper than buying new PVC mainline by a wide margin, if she could just seal the quick-latch couplers tightly enough to hold steady pressure, instead of the loose seal they're built for when farmers moved them by hand every few days. She spent the first 2 weeks of July fitting rubber gaskets, bought with egg money from the farmer's market in Sparta, into every one of the 60-some couplers along the collected pipe, working most evenings after supper on the concrete floor of the equipment shed with her grandfather's reading glasses pushed up on her own head because she kept forgetting to bring her own. $26 in gasket material that summer, and every cent of her egg money went into it. She dug the trench for the main line by hand over the better part of 3 weeks, working 2 hours most evenings before the light went, from the limestone sink down along the fence line to the top of the hayfield. Her father watched from the porch the first weekend without saying a word about it, then on the second weekend walked out with a second shovel and started digging alongside her without ever asking directly what she was building, which was about the most Daniel Kessler thing her father could possibly have done. The first attempt failed within the hour. 3 of the aluminum couplers, even with the new gaskets, weren't seating tight enough under standing pressure, and the line lost most of its flow at those 3 joints before the water traveled even 15 yards down the slope from the sink. She pulled those 3 couplers apart, added a second gasket layer to each, and tried again the following Saturday. The second attempt did better. Water reached the first row of drip emitters at the top of the field, but the flow arriving there was thin and uneven, some emitters producing a slow trickle and most producing almost nothing at all. She went back to Earl's bulletins that same night and found the section she needed, a short passage on pipe diameter and flow rate, explaining that the width of a delivery line determines not just the total volume of water that can move through it, but also how evenly pressure equalizes across the full length of a long run. The 2-inch aluminum main line was fine for the first 300 feet, but the final 100 feet running across the flatter top of the ridge needed to step down to a narrower 1-inch line to concentrate the remaining pressure into the drip tubing rather than losing it to volume the field didn't need at that final stretch. It took her most of the rest of July, trading spare lengths of her collected pipe with a retired vegetable farmer 2 roads over named Otis Bramlett, who had a shed full of old 1-inch black poly fittings left over from a commercial tomato operation he'd shut down back in 2009 and had no further use for. Otis traded her the fittings for the extra aluminum pipe sections she didn't need for the main run, and he never once asked her to make up the difference in value between what she gave him and what she got, telling her once, while she loaded fittings into a trailer, that he liked a kid who came back and tried a third time instead of quitting after the second failure the way most grown men he knew would have. On the third attempt, in the first week of August, the system finally held. Water moved from the limestone sink down through nearly 400 feet of 2-inch aluminum main line, stepped down to 1-inch line for the final 100 feet, and fed into drip tubing laid across the top 2 acres of the hayfield, delivering a slow, steady flow directly at the base of the fescue roots rather than across the leaves on top, where the August sun over White County would have simply taken the water back before it ever soaked in. Her father noticed the difference before anyone had to point it out to him. By the third week of August, the top 2 acres stood a noticeably darker green than the rest of the field, the fescue grown so thick a man could barely see bare ground beneath it, while the surrounding pastures, cut by the same summer drought, had gone thin and yellowed weeks earlier and stayed that way. One of the older farmers, a heavy-set man named Cecil Whitfield, who had been among those laughing at the feed store the previous June when Naomi's pipe collecting first came up in conversation, walked the rows slowly without saying much, then bent down and pulled up a handful of the thick fescue by the roots, studying the dark, moist soil still clinging to it in his weathered hand. "What'd you do different?" he finally asked her, straightening back up. She showed him the limestone sink at the north end of the property, the 26 feet of elevation that had been sitting there doing nothing as long as anyone could remember until somebody finally asked what it was for. The 2-inch main line stepping down to 1 inch at the final run, the drip tubing laid low against the soil instead of sprayed high across the leaves the way overhead water always was on a July afternoon. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, looking down the length of drip line disappearing into the thick fescue ahead of him. Then he asked her whether she thought the same system, scaled up, could reach the second ridge, where the cattle pasture had been struggling even worse than the hayfield all summer. Roy Tackett came back out officially in September, this time specifically to see the system rather than just checking on the property in passing. He walked the entire line with Naomi, asking careful questions and writing steadily in a small spiral notebook of his own, and told Daniel afterwards, standing at the tailgate of his extension service truck, that in 18 years of field work across 3 counties, he had never once seen a gravity-fed drip system built entirely from salvaged aluminum pipe and traded fittings perform the way this one had on a family farm with no engineering help of any kind behind it. He asked whether he could bring an agricultural engineering student down from Tennessee Tech the following spring to properly document how she sized the pipe diameters and the elevation drop. A reporter from the county paper drove out not long after that, and the story ran below the fold on the front page of the Sparta paper under a headline calling Naomi a young innovator, a phrase Naomi told her grandfather afterwards she found a little embarrassing, since all she felt she'd really done, she said, was ask what the water already wanted to do if nobody stood in its way. By October, word traveled the way word travels on the plateau. Slowly for weeks and then seemingly all at once, the same farmers who had handed an 11-year-old laughing child their old rusted pipe back in June drove out that fall to see the field for themselves, expecting to be politely impressed and not much more than that. What they found instead left most of them quiet. The top 2 acres of the Kessler hayfield stood a full shade darker green than every other field along Cane Creek, the fescue grown so thick a man could barely see bare ground beneath it, while the surrounding pastures, cut by the same summer drought, had gone thin and yellowed weeks earlier and stayed that way. One of the older farmers, a heavy-set man named Cecil Whitfield, who had been among those laughing at the feed store the previous June when Naomi's pipe collecting first came up in conversation, walked the rows slowly without saying much, then bent down and pulled up a handful of the thick fescue by the roots, studying the dark, moist soil still clinging to it in his weathered hand. "What'd you do different?" he finally asked her, straightening back up. She showed him the limestone sink at the north end of the property, the 26 feet of elevation that had been sitting there doing nothing as long as anyone could remember, until somebody finally asked what it was for. The 2-inch main lines stepping down to 1 inch at the final run, the drip tubing laid low against the soil instead of sprayed high across the leaves the way overhead water always was on a July afternoon. The laughter that had followed her all summer was gone entirely by then. In its place was something quieter, something that takes longer to arrive than laughter does, but that tends to last a good deal longer once it finally settles in. Several of the men standing in that field that October afternoon asked Naomi if she'd help them run something similar on their own ground before the next planting season came around. She told them she would. There is an old saying among people who have farmed difficult ground for a long time that the land doesn't care how old you are, only whether you're paying attention to it. Naomi Kessler grew exceptional hay that summer, water-efficient, drought-resistant hay that outperformed fields managed by men who had 30 and 40 years of experience behind them. But the real harvest that year was harder to weigh on any scale. It was the patience of a child who watched water instead of watching yields. It was the willingness to ask farmers for things they considered worthless and to see immediately what those things were actually still capable of. It was the discipline to fail twice in a row and go back and try a third time without complaint because the 26 feet of elevation had been sitting there the entire time, waiting for someone to notice it. It took her most of the rest of July, trading spare lengths of her collected pipe with a retired vegetable farmer 2 roads over named Otis Bramlett, who had a shed full of old 1-inch black poly fittings left over from a commercial tomato operation he'd shut down back in 2009 and had no further use for. Otis traded her the fittings for the extra aluminum pipe sections she didn't need for the main run, and he never once asked her to make up the difference in value between what she gave him and what she got, telling her once, while she loaded fittings into her trailer, that he liked a kid who came back and tried a third time instead of quitting after the second failure the way most grown men he knew would have. On the third attempt, in the first week of August, the system finally held. Water moved from the limestone sink down through nearly 400 feet of 2-inch aluminum mainline, stepped down to 1-inch line for the final 100 feet, and fed into drip tubing laid across the top 2 acres of the hayfield, delivering a slow, steady flow directly at the base of the fescue roots rather than across the leaves on top, where the August sun over White County would have simply taken the water back before it ever soaked in. Her father noticed the difference before anyone had to point it out to him. By the third week of August, the top 2 acres stood a noticeably darker green than the rest of the field, the fescue grown so thick a man could barely see bare ground beneath it, while the surrounding pastures, cut by the summer drought, had gone thin and yellowed weeks earlier and stayed that way